The lights in the slave hold flickered, casting erratic shadows across the cold, metallic walls. Chains clanked, metal scraping against metal as the newest batch of prisoners was herded into the stark, oppressive chamber. Alien voices echoed in the darkness, harsh, guttural, and incomprehensible to the human ear. Reaper barely registered the slave's mocking laughter as they herded him into the middle of the room. His eyes scanned the room quickly, measuring the distance to the guards, calculating the number of captives in the room, and assessing their state. The others were broken, defeated eyes, limp bodies, and quiet, resigned whispers. Their terror was palpable, a scent hanging in the air like decay. Yet he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Another human, one of the slaves sneered, a creature with reptilian scales and eyes that glowed faintly yellow. His voice was a low growl, thick with disdain. Weak. Soft. Like the rest of them. A second slave laughed, the sound like a hissing gasp. We'll have him begging for mercy before the cycle's up. Reaper stood still, his expression unreadable. There was no fear in him. His face, rough with days of confinement, didn't betray a single emotion. Despite his restraints, his hands bound by energy shackles and his feet shackled to the floor, his posture remained straight, his shoulders square. This wasn't the first time he'd been captured. It wouldn't be the last. The slaves continued their assessment of the new arrivals, their laughter echoing off the walls. But one slaver, more senior than the others, stopped his casual inspection when he saw Reaper. His reptilian features twisted with a flicker of interest, then suspicion. His file, the slaver muttered. He clicked a few buttons on his wrist pad, bringing up the human's profile. The strange alien eyes narrowed. Callsign, Reaper? How quaint. He sneered. Let's see if this Reaper proves to be anything more than another soft human. Reaper's gaze didn't falter. He had expected this, underestimations. But what the slavers didn't understand was that a name meant little in the face of survival. The slaver stepped closer, inspecting him more thoroughly. No family, no affiliation. Just a name. He looked back at his fellow slavers. A coward. Reaper didn't react. He didn't need to. Let them think him weak. Let them think he was just another worthless prisoner. They would learn soon enough. Zyron, the frail alien beside him, shivered at the sound of the slaver's mocking laughter. He was a short, thin thing with sickly green skin and large, mournful eyes. His clothes were ragged, hanging from his skeletal frame. Despite the fear that gripped him, he couldn't stop himself from whispering to Reaper, his voice barely audible. They'll kill you. They kill everyone. Zyron's voice cracked with desperation. Why fight? It's hopeless. Reaper glanced at the alien, his eyes cold and calculating. I don't fight to win, he said quietly. I fight to end them. Zyron froze, confusion and fear flickering across his features. What does that mean? Reaper didn't respond. He didn't need to explain. His intentions were clear, this was far from hopeless. He knew the slavers' routine. He knew the weak spots in that fortress of a ship. And he knew something they didn't. Humans don't break. As the guards patrolled, Reaper's mind moved with precision, carefully watching every move, every shift in posture, every discarded piece of information the slavers gave off. They had brought him here to break him, to sell him to the highest bidder as just another product. But the slavers underestimated one thing: he was human. The heavy door at the far side of the room swung open, and two more slavers entered, dragging a new group of prisoners into the chamber. The hum of energy shackles clattered against the cold floor as the newcomers were herded like cattle. One of them, a hulking alien with multiple sets of arms, stumbled and fell to the ground, whimpering in pain. Another alien spat at the slavers, only to receive a brutal kick in return. The prisoners groaned in misery as they were forced to kneel. Reaper's eyes narrowed, and his mind moved at lightning speed. He had to act quickly. The ship was on high alert. They'd be moved to holding cells soon, and once there, the chance of escape would be slim. The slavers were distracted, as expected. The room was rife with tension, a perfect opportunity. But for now, patience was key. Zyron's voice cut through the tension again, this time softer. You're planning something, aren't you? Reaper's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, but it was enough to send a shiver through the alien's thin frame. I don't need to plan. I need to wait. For a moment, silence filled the room, punctuated only by the groans of the beaten prisoners and the occasional bark of orders from the slavers. The minutes stretched into hours, each one testing the patience of everyone involved. And then, finally, the opportunity arrived. The door to the chamber slammed open with a clang, and in strode the commander, Orvosh, the leader of the slavers aboard this ship. His massive, reptilian form filled the doorway, and his yellow eyes scanned the room coldly. The other slavers immediately straightened, their posture changing from casual to tense. His gaze briefly passed over Reaper, before lingering on the other prisoners. He grunted and turned to his subordinates. Move them to the holding cells. We'll transport them to market once we reach the sector. Reaper's mind raced. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. In that instant, the shackles holding him to the floor made a faint clicking noise. He looked up to see Zyron staring at him, his eyes wide, confused. Reaper didn't waste another second. He surged forward, the shackles snapping off as he powered through the energy field, his body moving like a coiled spring. The slavers barely had time to react. The first guard dropped to the floor before his weapon even cleared its holster. A second guard was dead before his scream could escape. The other prisoners scrambled in chaos, but Reaper's focus remained absolute. The slavers' arrogant laughter had turned to panic. Zyron's voice, barely a whisper, came from behind him. You really are different. Reaper didn't answer. His mind was already 5 steps ahead. There was no more time for words. Only action. And he had only just begun. The ship's engines roared like a thunderstorm as it hurtled through the cold, black void of space, but the prisoners inside the Yveth dominance were hardly aware of the ship's speed. They had been herded into holding cells, a temporary respite before being shipped off to the galaxy's dark underbelly where they'd be sold for labor, amusement, or worse. The clang of metal against metal echoed down the halls, but inside the cells, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional sob or soft whisper of defeated souls. Reaper's cell was at the end of the hall, furthest from the slavers' control center. His wrists were still bound in shimmering energy shackles, but his mind was already calculating his next move. He had taken out 2 guards with ease during his initial surge, but that had only been the beginning. There were still many more to contend with. The mission had only just begun. The only sound in the cell now was the rhythmic breathing of Zyron, who had been quiet ever since Reaper's assault on the guards. The alien was still stunned by what he had witnessed, an unbroken human, a force in motion that tore apart the slaver's facade of invincibility. He watched Reaper with a mixture of awe and fear. Zyron hesitated, his voice barely more than a whisper. You really think you can defeat them all? Reaper's gaze remained fixed on the cold, unyielding door, his posture still tense despite the apparent calm. I don't think, Zyron. I know. Zyron's eyes widened at the certainty in Reaper's voice. He had seen many prisoners come and go, humans included. But none had ever stood so unwavering, so certain. In all his years of being shuffled between captors, Zyron had learned one lesson: survival was a game of appeasement. Resistance only led to death. But Reaper was something different. The door slid open with a soft hiss. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. 2 slavers appeared, carrying energy rifles and wearing smirks on their faces. Their posture was relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension Reaper felt building in his muscles. They didn't know what was coming. You're just wasting your time, human, one of the slavers grunted, his reptilian features barely visible under the harsh lighting. He eyed Reaper, sizing him up. You're trapped. Even if you somehow manage to kill us all, there's nowhere to run. Reaper did not flinch. His eyes remained cold, calculating. I'll find a way. I always do. The slaver's lips twisted into a grin, baring jagged teeth. A cocky human. That's all you are. But don't worry, you'll be dead soon enough. The slaver raised his rifle, preparing to fire. Reaper's mind clicked into overdrive. With one fluid motion, his hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the nearby cot and swinging it towards the slaver's face. The metal frame collided with his skull with a sickening crunch. The second slaver fired in surprise, but the blast hit nothing but the empty air where Reaper had been. In one motion, Reaper disarmed the second slaver, throwing him against the far wall with enough force to crack the plaster. His energy rifle clattered to the ground. The first slaver, dazed but still conscious, staggered back, reaching for his weapon. "You think you can defeat us?" the slaver growled, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We are the Wyveth. We—" Before he could finish, Reaper was on him. The human's fist slammed into the slaver's face, each punch landing with precision and brutal force. The slaver's body crumpled under the onslaught, collapsing into a heap of scales and blood. Zyron gasped, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and awe. He had never seen anything like it, a human, outnumbered, still somehow prevailing. Reaper wasn't just fighting, he was destroying. Reaper stood over the fallen slaver, his breathing steady but fast, his heart pumping adrenaline through his veins. He wiped the blood from his hands and turned to Zyron, his eyes intense and focused. "We don't have much time," he said in a low voice. "They'll come looking for us soon." Zyron nodded, his voice shaky. What are we supposed to do now? We're just two of us." Reaper's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Then we make them see what happens when they underestimate humanity." As they made their way through the ship's corridors, Reaper moved with surgical precision. Each step was measured, every movement calculated. He was a man on a mission, his thoughts far ahead of his body's actions. He knew the layout of the ship by heart, the weak points, the structural flaws. This wasn't just an escape, this was war. The tension in the air was thick, and Zyron could barely keep up, his body trembling as they walked. He had spent so long being a victim, a prisoner. But now, with Reaper by his side, there was something new, something strange and dangerous stirring in him. Hope. As they turned a corner, they saw two more slavers stationed outside a reinforced door. They hadn't seen them yet, but that would change in moments. Reaper held up a hand, signaling for Zyron to stop. He scanned the hallway. There was a way around them, through the ventilation shafts. Zyron, still recovering from the earlier shock, spoke in a strained whisper. "We can't, there's no way. We're just two." Reaper's eyes locked onto the slavers ahead. "I'm not alone," he said, his voice steady. "Not anymore." He moved quickly, grabbing Zyron by the arm and pulling him into a darkened alcove just as the slavers began to walk toward them. The sound of footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Reaper's muscles tensed, waiting. The two slavers passed by, unaware of the two humans hiding just a few feet away. Reaper's chest heaved silently as he allowed himself a breath. His mind was always calculating, always one step ahead. As the slavers continued down the hallway, Reaper and Zyron ducked into the ventilation shaft. They climbed into the narrow passage, their bodies pressed tightly together. The shaft smelled of oil and dust, the air thick and stale. Reaper didn't speak. He didn't need to. His mission was clear, and he wasn't going to stop until every last slaver on this ship was erased from existence. The only thing that mattered now was survival, and the fall of the Wyveth. The air in the ventilation shaft was thick with the stench of old oil and burnt circuitry, the pipes groaning and hissing with every minor tremor. Reaper moved like a shadow, silent and precise, his boots barely making a sound on the metal floor. Zyron, trailing behind, was less practiced, his steps hesitant and unsteady. The shafts were narrow, and the confines seemed to tighten around him with every step, but he dared not voice his discomfort. His fear was something he'd learned to keep to himself, except now, it was giving way to something new. Hope. And uncertainty. "How far are we going?" Zyron's voice broke the silence, shaky but determined. Reaper didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the dark, his senses heightened. The faint hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the walls. They were moving toward the heart of the slaver ship now, and every step felt like a step closer to their potential death, or freedom. "We're getting close," Reaper said, his voice as steady as always. "Stay quiet." Zyron nodded, though the anxiety clawed at him. They had been moving through the ducts for what felt like hours, the passageway winding and turning in ways that had confused even Reaper's sharp mind. But he had an uncanny sense of direction, and the deeper they went, the closer they came to the central command room, the place where the slaver's power lay. Suddenly, a screeching noise echoed in the distance, followed by muffled voices. Reaper's instincts flared. The slavers were moving in their direction, and they were much too close for comfort. The ventilation shaft was their best bet, but it was also a trap, claustrophobic and easily overwhelmed. Reaper moved first, flattening himself against the cold metal of the shaft. He motioned for Zyron to follow suit, but the alien hesitated, his body tense with fear. "Stay down," Reaper whispered sharply, his gaze never leaving the open-air vent just ahead. "They can't see us if we don't move." The muffled voices grew louder, and Zyron could hear the unmistakable sound of armored feet stomping in the hallway below. The slavers were close, too close. "Why are they so loud?" Zyron whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. Reaper's jaw tightened. "Arrogance. They know they are in control. It makes them careless." As the slavers' voices grew nearer, Reaper's mind raced. He could hear their conversation clearly now, a mixture of guttural words and laughter, their confidence palpable. They had no idea what was about to happen. The sound of footsteps stopped. Zyron froze, his body trembling slightly. There were two slavers just beneath them, their conversation filtering up through the vents. "Did you hear? The humans been killing us off one by one," one slaver said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A human. That's rich. You think he's gonna survive this?" "We have him cornered now," the second slaver replied. "No way he's making it past the main deck. We'll flush him out and deal with him." A sharp, biting sound interrupted him. Reaper moved with a speed and precision that was impossible to follow. He dropped from the vent and tackled the first slaver to the ground, his hand around the alien's throat before the creature could even react. The second slaver fumbled for his weapon, but it was already too late. Reaper's fist collided with the slaver's jaw, sending him sprawling across the floor. With a speed that made Zyron's head spin, Reaper took the fallen guard's energy rifle and turned it toward the remaining slaver, his cold gaze unwavering. "You're not in control," Reaper said, his voice like steel. The slaver scrambled back, eyes wide with panic. You're a dead man," he shouted, but Reaper didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted the rifle, aiming directly between the slaver's eyes. "Not today," Reaper replied coldly. A burst of energy exploded from the rifle, and the slaver dropped, lifeless, to the floor. Zyron stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Reaper, the human who had done the impossible, who had killed without hesitation, was now standing tall, his face expressionless as if it was just another task completed. He was a machine of destruction, but there was something more beneath the cold efficiency, something deep, burning. Reaper wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to send a message. Reaper holstered the rifle and turned toward Zyron, his expression momentarily softening. "You good?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Zyron nodded, but his legs felt weak beneath him. I think so. But how long do you think we can keep this up? They're going to keep coming for us, aren't they?" Reaper didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the hallway ahead, his mind already moving on to the next phase of their plan. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Reaper finally said. "And we're going to do it fast." Zyron felt a flicker of disbelief. "You think we can really defeat them all? You've already killed 2 of them, but there are so many." Reaper's eyes narrowed. "I've taken down entire battalions before. They won't stand a chance." Zyron could hear the certainty in Reaper's voice, and for the first time since their escape, a strange sense of calm began to settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The two moved swiftly down the narrow corridor, Reaper leading the way, each step measured and deliberate. They passed several more guards along the way, each one unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing within the ship. Reaper took them down without hesitation, using their weapons against them, using their overconfidence against them. The slavers were about to learn what humanity was capable of. Reaper paused at a door, his eyes scanning the control panel beside it. "This is it," he said. "We're going to overload the core and send this ship straight to hell." Zyron looked at the door, dread creeping into his chest. "Are you sure? We'll never make it out in time if we do that." Reaper's eyes locked onto his. "I'm sure." With a steady hand, Reaper began to hack into the control panel. Zyron stood guard, his heart pounding in his chest as the seconds ticked by. This was it, their last chance to destroy the slaver ship once and for all. There was no turning back now. The timer on the console blinked green. "We're good," Reaper said, his voice low and determined. "Let's move." The ship would burn. The slavers would be no more. And humanity would make sure the galaxy knew it. The corridors of the Yveth dominance trembled under the weight of impending chaos. The ship was silent, too silent. Reaper moved swiftly through the narrow passages, the weight of his weapon heavy in his hands. His pulse was steady, his mind calm, but his heart hammered with anticipation. He had set the plan in motion, and there was no turning back now. Zyron, trailing a few paces behind, was quieter than usual. The tremors of fear still lingered in his frame, but there was something different in his posture. A subtle change. He was no longer just following, he was beginning to understand. The alien's body language had shifted. His steps were more measured, more confident. For the first time, Zyron wasn't just a passenger in this fight. He was part of it. Reaper's voice broke the silence, low and purposeful. "We're almost there." Zyron nodded, though his gaze flicked nervously to the walls, as if expecting another slaver to appear at any moment. "You're sure we can destroy the core?" His voice was tinged with doubt. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air. Reaper's eyes were cold, focused. "We can. I've done it before." The door ahead slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the ship's central control room. The lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the walls. The room was dominated by a massive console, surrounded by a few slavers who stood idle, unaware of the storm brewing in their midst. They were relaxed, overconfident, as though nothing could possibly challenge their control. That, Reaper knew, was their fatal mistake. Zyron froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the slavers. He hadn't expected so many of them. The two of them had been killing slavers in pairs, but this? This was an entire control room, with a dozen or more heavily armed soldiers. Reaper's hand tightened on the rifle's grip. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "We don't have time for hesitation," he muttered, barely audible. Zyron, still caught between fear and resolve, followed Reaper's lead. The human moved with deadly precision, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He didn't hesitate as he raised his weapon and fired. The first slaver crumpled before he even had a chance to react, the shockwave from the blast tearing through the air. The second slaver's scream echoed as he fell to the ground, blood splattering across the polished metal floor. The room erupted in chaos. Slavers scrambled for weapons, their shock turning to frantic panic. The control room was filled with confusion, shouted orders, weapons being drawn, the distinct click of energy rifles charging. But Reaper moved too quickly. His rifle danced through the chaos, cutting down one slaver after another. Each shot was a calculated strike, each enemy dispatched with cold efficiency. He didn't give them a moment to regain control. Zyron, his hands trembling, had drawn his own weapon, an old, battered sidearm he'd scavenged from a fallen slaver. He was still learning to fight, still uncertain, but he was trying. He fired his weapon with shaking hands, and to his surprise, he hit his target. A slaver, caught off guard, dropped to the floor with a heavy thud. "Nice shot," Reaper called over his shoulder, but he was already moving on to the next target. The compliments were rare, but in this moment, Zyron could hear the approval in Reaper's voice. It gave him a surge of confidence, and he fired again, this time with more purpose. The room was chaotic, the hum of blast of fire filling the air, but in the center of it all stood Reaper, unshaken, his movements fluid and precise. He was the storm in the heart of the ship, and the slavers were powerless against it. The last slaver, a hulking brute, lunged at Reaper with a jagged knife, his eyes wild with rage. Reaper barely flinched. He sidestepped the attack effortlessly, disarming the slaver with a swift, brutal motion. The knife clattered to the ground as Reaper slammed his fist into the slaver's chest, sending him sprawling back, gasping for breath. Xiron watched in awe as the human dispatched the last of their foes. In a matter of seconds, the room fell silent once more. The dead slavers lay scattered across the floor, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their weapons discarded. Reaper stood over them, breathing evenly, his eyes scanning the room with an almost predatory focus. Xiron could barely comprehend what had just happened. In mere moments, Reaper had reduced the entire control room to chaos. This was no longer just survival, this was destruction. Reaper turned to Xiron, his eyes locking onto the alien's wide-eyed expression. "Get to the console," he said, his voice calm despite the violence they just wrought. "Set the core to overload." Xiron swallowed hard, nodding quickly. He moved toward the control panel, his hands shaking as he approached. The panel was covered in alien symbols, flashing red lights indicating the ship was on high alert. The ship's central reactor was just ahead, deep within the heart of the vessel. Reaper had taught him enough about that technology for him to know what to do. But the fear still clawed at him. Xiron hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at Reaper. "What if we can't make it out in time?" Reaper's voice was low but resolute. "We will." With a trembling hand, Xiron began typing on the console. The alien symbols danced across the screen, but Xiron recognized them now. He knew what needed to be done. The ship's reactor needed to be primed for a critical overload, a chain reaction that would tear the vessel apart. Suddenly, the console beeped, its screen flashing a warning. "Warning, reactor instability detected. Proceed with caution." The countdown timer began ticking down. The overload had been initiated. "Time's up," Reaper said, his tone dark and unwavering. "Let's go." Xiron's heart pounded in his chest as the countdown continued, each second stretching longer than the last. He followed Reaper out of the control room, his mind racing. The ship was going to explode. The only question was, would they make it out in time? The two moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the ship as alarms blared and the walls trembled under the strain of the reactor's destabilization. Reaper's eyes remained cold, focused. He didn't look back. He had already seen the inevitable in his mind. They passed through the halls, barely avoiding the remaining slavers as the ship's corridors began to buckle and warp under the strain. The ship was dying, but Reaper and Xiron were alive. And that, Reaper knew, was what mattered. The countdown hit 0, and the ship began to burn.